Hi, hello. My name is Tami Sirkis, and I'm a certified wellness coach and a crowd educator about food and healing. I'm an active speaker, speak too much, blogger, recipe writer, and a YouTuber. I'm a frequent guest, I'm happy to say, on television and radio shows, and I talk all the time about low-carb eating and low-carb living. Wow. This after years of writing cookbooks and recipes for cakes and desserts and all kinds of yummy things that evidently were not the best thing that we should have been eating. Most of the Israeli people in this room may recognize my name, thanks to my mother, Ruth Sirkis, who I think is safe to say that my mom is the Israeli Julia Child. I grew up literally surrounded by food and cookbooks. I must tell you that for me, standing on this stage at the end of an amazing summit with the speakers that I met and heard in this is more exciting to me than if I would have met Bruce Springsteen or Beyonce or Lady Gaga. They are mere rock stars. But you people that came from far away, you rocked my world. This is very personal. Picture this. Passover Day, 7.5 years ago, my dear friend, Mira Leibovich, which is here in the crowd, is telling me about a book that she is reading and is causing her jaw to drop every few pages. The author says that we have got it all wrong. It's not about calories, it's about insulin. Carbs make us fat and sick, and fat makes us lose weight. Wow. Since you are more plump, I was more plump than her, she said, stating the obvious. She offered that I try it on myself and let's see what happens. Thus started my journey to learn, practice, and teach the low-carb way of life. By Rosh Hashanah, I think in holidays, by Rosh Hashanah, 6 months later, I found my mission in life and I lost 18 kilos, most of which I did not return. Since then, there has not been one day that I have not learned something new by listening to these lovely people that came from abroad, by listening to your lectures, to your podcasts, to your online talks, reading your books, your articles, your blog posts, your newsletters, your publications, by all of our dear guests that came from abroad and their colleagues, of course, from around the world. I am your groupie, and I'm really groupie. You, all of you, even the females, you are, as my opinion, the alpha males of our international cyber tribe. You are fighting the battles against big pharma and big food companies. You are hunting and gathering information, proof, and shameful lies that we were taught. In the big scheme of things, I see myself as a local alpha female, making sense of the bounty that you bring, translating it into Hebrew, and cutting it into bite-sized portions of instructions, turning all this information into shopping lists, into a family menu, into a recipe for daily use. Someone has to do that job, and I do it. That's what I did to my family and in my home, and that's what I help my readers and my clients to do every day. And it all started with one good friend and one good book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. So it is my great privilege to introduce to you Mr. Gary Taubes, an investigative science and health journalist. He is the author of the books the case against sugar, why we get fat, and what to do about it, good calories, bad calories, of course, and to thank you personally. You changed my life and my health. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have to say one thing about that's incredibly moving, but Springsteen is Springsteen, okay? I mean, they're just lines I can't cross. So this talk is a case against sugar. My disclosures, I said yes, I have no technical disclosures. I write books. I get honoraries for the books. They obviously make very strong points. I get royalties from the books, honoraria, and I'm supported by CrossFit, for which I'm grateful. So this is kind of coming from a different space and answering a different question. And one of the lessons I've learned in the, going on 40 years that I've been studying science is that, and Ivor made this point as well, that the question you ask determines the answer you get. So if you ask the wrong question, you'll get the wrong answer. So this quote, I also like to collect epigraphs. It's just what I do. If you notice, my books always have these pithy scientific epigraphs. Peter Medawar, Nobel laureate, said, "Scientific theories begin, if you like, as stories. And the purpose of the critical rectifying episode in scientific reasoning is precisely to find out whether or not these stories are stories about real life." And so what I'm going to tell you today is a story. And then I'm also going to explain in the course of telling you this story why the critical rectifying episode in scientific reasoning never happened. So the best we've got is a story, and that's what we have to live with. And then I've been studying science, I said, since 1980, the history, philosophy of science. And this quote by Claude Bernard, I only read his book, An Introduction to Experimental Medicine, the study of experimental medicine, about 10 years ago. And he said, all human knowledge is limited to working back from observed effects to their cause. And we often forget this. Often even in the diet nutrition world, we hear about potential causes of disease, but we don't hear about the observed disease effect or epidemic that we're trying to reverse if we remove that cause. So in this case, the observed effect, and you can think of it as the crime that's been committed, and we're trying to find the perpetrator of that crime. The observed effect is worldwide epidemics of obesity, diabetes, and related chronic diseases following the nutritional transition from traditional diets and lifestyles to Western diets and lifestyles. So this is the question that I'm asking. What's the cause of that? Because every population in the world, as we'll discuss, when they transition from whatever their traditional diet is to a Western diet and lifestyle, experiences these epidemics of obesity and diabetes. And then the thesis, the story is that it's caloric sweeteners, specifically sucrose, sugar, the white stuff we put in our coffee, and high fructose or high fructose syrups are the cause. So the interesting thing about this epidemics. In the United States, you can actually see them begin. You can see them begin in every country, and we're going to talk about this. But in the U.S., they have the oldest history. So this story starts with Elliot Jocelyn and a single observation. Jocelyn, in the early years of the 20th century, became what was known as the sort of god of diabetes treatment and research in the United States. As a young doctor just out of Harvard Medical School in 1898, he published this paper with Reginald Fitz, who was a famous pathologist already at the time at Harvard. And they examined the case histories. They went back through all the case study, every single case at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, which was a major urban hospital in Boston, to study every case of diabetes, because Jocelyn wanted to understand this disease better. It had already experienced in one of his patients. He had seen it, a young Irish emigre to Boston. His mother got diabetes. He wanted to understand how it was treated and see if he could figure out how to best to treat it. So they went through 48,000 handwritten records at Mass General over the course of 74 years. And the interesting question asked is, how many cases of diabetes did they see? And I'll tell you right now, in the United States, if you look at sort of the incidence of diabetes in the Veterans Administration hospitals, it's 1 in 4. They found 172 cases over 74 years. 1 in every 280 patients. And that was total. The interesting thing about it is they went through the cases, they broke it into 5 different periods, and the number of cases went up with each consecutive period. And as you can see, from 1824 to 1840, there were only 7 cases of diabetes in the record, which meant that there were years that there were 0 cases of diabetes at the largest and most important hospital in Boston, and the percentage of cases went up year by year. And they noticed this as well. So the percentage of patients so they realized that they were seeing this interesting increase. But what's interesting at the time is that Joslin didn't see it as the beginning of an epidemic. What he thought was that it was a good thing, that more and more patients with diabetes were taking themselves off to the hospital to be treated, which could be true. I mean, it was interesting, in the 19th century, if you were sick, it was a very good idea actually to avoid doctors, because they were liable to accelerate your demise as cured with leaching and other techniques. So people didn't want to go to the doctors. Hospitals only tended to see the poor members of the society. So there are a lot of ways to explain what they were seeing. But you could see the same pattern in other populations. So it's funny, Mass General Hospital is wonderful because they have archivists today that allowed me to call them up and say, could you go back and document if what Joslin saw was true, which it was. And Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, which is the oldest hospital in Philadelphia, also has their records back to 1867. And I could call their archivists in the course of my work and ask them to look for cases of diabetes. And you see, in effect, the exact same. It's delayed in Philadelphia by about 30 years, but from 1867 to about 1910, there were years with 0 cases of diabetes. And then you see this explosion. So here's the epidemic. That's it. And the question is, what's causing that? And in 1921, when Joslin wrote about the prevention of diabetes mellitus in JAMA, he was now using the term epidemic to discuss it. And he was talking about the increase in diabetes rates doubling in rates in Massachusetts, in the United States. He actually talked about a single street, a single block in Oxford, Massachusetts, where he grew up, where 4 of the 7 adults living in adjacent houses had gotten diabetes and died from it, and talked about how if this was an infectious disease, the health services would be all over this. In 1924, Haven Emerson, who was head of the New York City Department of Health, and his colleague Louise Larimore published their data looking at differences in diabetes rates from 1920 to 1921, differences in mortality rates, and you could see them doubling, in some cases increasing dramatically in American cities. So this diabetes epidemic that we're living through, you could see it begin in the 19th century, and then by the 1920s, physicians were seriously worried about what might be the cause. And as Joslin said then, he said, there are entirely too many diabetic patients in the country. Statistics for the last 30 years show so great an increase in the number that unless this were in part explained by a better recognition of the disease, which in fact it surely was. So it's interesting, up until the 1870s, 1880s, if physicians wanted to diagnose diabetes in their patients, they had their assistants have taste the urine to see if it was sweet. So you could imagine they missed a lot of diagnoses. And then they developed a urine test, and the insurance companies got involved, and the insurance companies didn't want to insure diabetics, so they made sure that people... So they would certainly explain some of the increase they were seeing, but the question is, would it explain all of it? And then Joslin raised this question, the outlook for the future. So you ask this question, what was the outlook for the future? And then we get to today. And today, with the estimate is 30 million Americans are diabetic. That's 1 in 11 Americans. In Israel, you see these dramatic levels of diabetes rates in 30% in the 65 to 74 age group, and even more. That's 1 in 3. Worldwide, I showed this quote yesterday, this from Margaret Chan, Director General of the World Health Organization. She said diabetes is one of the biggest global health crises of the 21st century, and worldwide the diabetes prevalence increased 4-fold between 1980 and 2014, and the incidence, the prevalence doubled in that time period. And she called it a slow-motion disaster, and I use this quote as well. She said the probability of keeping a bad situation from getting much worse was virtually 0. So again, the question you want to ask is if we're going to prevent this disorder, I mean, Galen said this 2,000 years ago, if you want to prevent and treat a disease, you have to identify the cause. And if you don't identify the cause, your treatments and your methods of prevention are going to fail. So this is the observation for which we need a cause, this kind of epidemic increase. And you can see this in virtually every population where people measure it. Here's a chart of diabetes in the Navajo, Native American tribe in the U.S., and you can see it just blasts upward beginning in the 1960s. In Japan, you see the same tendencies. Here's the curve of diabetes just in the past 60 years in the U.S. You have a 700% increase in diabetes incidence in 60 years. And similar patterns observed again everywhere people look. This is what I mean: Inuit, the First Nations people in Canada, Polynesians, Micronesians, Melanesians, Aboriginal populations in Australia, Maoris in New Zealand. Everywhere people go, transition to a Western diet and lifestyle, you have this increase. So what's the cause? That's what we want to know. That's the question I'm asking. What's the cause of this pandemic? And another way to think about it is, what's the environmental trigger? The agent. When you wanted to make progress in chronic infectious diseases, 150 years ago, a third of people in the world come down with tuberculosis and die from consumption. You needed the germ theory of the disease, and eventually you could create hygiene, public health hygienic programs to make sure that we avoided as much as possible the germs that were causing the disease, and eventually could get antibiotics that could treat them. But you have to identify the agent. If you don't correctly identify the agent, you won't solve the problem. So what aspect? We know some aspect of the Western diet and lifestyle is to blame. And then other questions. Why aren't we doing everything we can possibly to find out? And I'm going to discuss this. Why aren't we questioning our assumptions? And why is no one being held accountable other than the victims and maybe the food industry? And by that, I mean, why are no heads rolling? The same people who were in charge of our public health efforts and our research efforts 40 years ago, when these epidemics were barely visible, are still in charge of them today, despite the fact that they've completely failed to handle these epidemics. And the answer is pretty simple. We think we know the answer. So the answer is this: type 2 diabetes is caused by obesity or excess fat accumulation. That's the conventional wisdom. And excess fat accumulation is caused by overconsumption, which I talked about yesterday, and I'll touch on briefly again. So diabetes epidemics are certainly associated with obesity epidemics, and that's why we believe the two are causal, and type 2 diabetes and obesity in individual patients are tightly associated. And in children, too, when you see diabetes epidemics, you see obesity epidemics in kids. What you don't know is which is cause and which is effect. So here's the complication. The conventional thinking is also, while it's simple, diabetes is caused by obesity, obesity is caused by overeating, that you will simultaneously hear that obesity and diabetes are multifactorial complex diseases. Okay, and there are all these variables involved, and part of this is true, there are all these variables involved, and part of it is the way we fund science. If you fund 2,000 researchers to ask 2,000 different questions on the cause of a disorder, you'll get 2,000 different answers. Again, if they're not asking the right questions, and each one of those answers has to be important if the people want to get further funding. So you end up with this sort of mess of complexity. This diagram is actually relatively simple compared to some I've seen trying to describe the cause and effect. So the counter-argument to the multifactorial complex answer is Occam's razor, which famously is defined as never multiply hypotheses beyond necessity. That sounds a little complicated. This is Einstein's version of it. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. So this is often perverted to mean that the simple answer is always right, or the simplest answer is always right, but that's not what this means. It means when you're trying to solve a problem, you start with the simple hypothesis. Okay? And usually, so for instance, you have when we're talking here about multiple epidemics around the world, all of obesity and diabetes, we could be talking, a metaphor would be the same crime being committed in every country in the world. Or in Tel Aviv, you see this murders, 20 murders, they all have the same MO, the same modus operandi. you're going to assume that it's a serial murderer committing all 20 murderers. If you arrest someone for the crime and you put them in jail, and then you get 5 more similar murders, now you have to complicate your hypothesis. Now there's either 2 murderers, maybe the second are a copycat or the first one was wrong, but you start with the simplest possible hypothesis and you move from there. So the simplest possible hypothesis is a single agent in this case. And the question I asked in doing my research is, what about sugar? So that doesn't mean, so now remember, the question we're trying to answer here is, what do we have to add to any traditional diet to begin the process of an obesity and diabetes epidemic, which is a very different question than what do we have to remove from our diets today to reverse obesity and diabetes in our patients. And the answer I'm proposing is sugar. And when you look at the history, what's interesting is that sugar was at the scene of the crime in all of these various epidemics. Whenever a population experiences an obesity and diabetes epidemic, they experience the Western diet and lifestyle, and the Western diet is fundamentally sugar, refined flour. But sugar is often key, and in the US it's fascinating. This is 1800, our sugar consumption was about 5 pounds per capita. And by the end of the 1900s, it was up to 90 pounds. What happened during the century was the 1840s saw the beginning of 3 different industries: the candy industry, the chocolate industry, and the ice cream industry. All began in the 1840s and took off. Chocolate bars were first created by the Lindt brothers in Switzerland, and Lindt chocolate is still a very common chocolate to be found. And in the 1880s, you had the soft drink industry with Dr. Pepper, Coca-Cola, and PepsiCo. And by 1900, these had become ubiquitous throughout the United States, so every family in the country could drink as much soda as they wanted. And you also had the sugar cane industry throughout, and the beet sugar industry began around the 1850s and took off. So as this epidemic took off, as you saw, also sugar consumption began as well, and particularly, I think, sugary beverage and consumption. And the interesting thing is it was always the prime suspect. It seemed to be the obvious suspect. So as early as 1907, the British Medical Association had a special session at their annual meeting on diabetes in the tropics, because the British physicians working in India had realized that there was a diabetes epidemic happening in India. They saw what was happening in India, what was happening what Jocelyn was seeing in the US, and it was seen in particular socioeconomic groups and groups that were living most like Western the West. So Frederick Allen, who was a leading authority on diabetes in the U.S. before Jocelyn took over, in his book, he discussed the British Medical Association conference. He said the consumption of sugar is undoubtedly increasing. It's generally recognized that diabetes is increasing, and to a considerable extent, its incidence is greatest among the races and the classes of society that consume the most sugar. And then Emerson and Larimore, I showed the chart from their 1924 paper. They said the same thing. It's apparent that rises and falls in the sugar consumption are followed with fair regularity by similar rises and falls in the death rate from diabetes. And when you see, they published this chart. So there was the death rates from diabetes in the United States, England, and Wales, and in Paris. And you could see it tracking pretty closely with sugar consumption. The problem with these kinds of associations, so these drops here are World War I. In all cases, and there was rationing, and a lot of things change, and a lot of things are rationed in war. So you can't use that kind of evidence to infer causality, but it certainly raises a hypothesis. So you ask what happened to this argument. The interesting thing about medicine that I found in doing my research is it's a very authoritarian study. You're taught to believe what the leading authorities believe. I think because in medical school you don't have really, there's so much you have to learn and so much you have to memorize that you can't have this culture that we have in science. Do I really have 10 seconds to go? Or did this not get reset? Okay. Okay. The reason this theory went away, Jocelyn didn't like it. Jocelyn had debates with Emerson and Larimore, and by 1924-25, Jocelyn was the god of diabetes. And he had a lot of rationale for it. So He said the Japanese ate a lot of carbohydrates and they had little diabetes, which was true. And what Jocelyn didn't realize was that sugar is different from other carbohydrates. So the Japanese have high carb diets because they ate a lot of rice, and they didn't get Jocelyn diabetes. But I don't know why Jocelyn didn't realize that sugar and carbs are different, but it's worth reminding people because the problem is we have this phrase blood sugar. And blood sugar is blood glucose, and carbohydrates, starches, and rice break down and are digested and metabolize the glucose. So that's starches and grains, but sugar is a combination of glucose and fructose. And what's interesting is in modern times, we tend to study the effect of fructose alone, but you never consume fructose alone. You always consume it with glucose in a 50-50 mixture. So sucrose is the molecule of glucose bonded to a molecule of fructose. It's a dimer. High fructose corn syrup, which became huge in the U.S. In the late 1970s, is monomers at 45% glucose and 55% fructose. But this molecule is broken up almost immediately upon digestion, so there's very little evidence that they have any meaningful different metabolic effects. And then in Japan, it's interesting. When you look at this period in Japan when they had virtually no diabetes, that was a period when they were eating virtually no sugar during World War I. So if Jocelyn had bothered to look at sugar consumption in Japan, he would have realized that it was exceedingly low and it would not have been evidence that could refute this hypothesis. The other problem is that sugar was valuable for hypoglycemic episodes caused by insulin. So insulin was a new drug and was discovered in 1921, and it's very hard to dose. It's still very hard to dose, and if you wanted to bail someone out of a hypoglycemic episode, you gave them candy or you gave them orange juice, and people like Jocelyn and its equivalent in the UK, Hemsworth, both thought that in this case sugar is a very good thing, so it was hard for them to imagine it as a bad thing. And then you had this argument we still have today, which is most diabetes is caused by getting fat, which was caused by eating too much or exercising too little. So this is how Jocelyn put it. He said diabetes is largely a penalty of obesity, and the greater the obesity, the more likely is nature to enforce it. With an excess of fat, diabetes begins, and from an excess of fat, diabetics die. And part of one of the themes we've been dealing with in this conference is this question: why are diabetics given low-fat diets that are high in carbs when we know that it's the carbohydrates they can't tolerate? And part of the answer is because of this kind of logic. They assume that dietary fat either made people fat or dietary fat caused heart disease, and diabetics are at such a high risk of heart disease, we should feed them low-fat diets, and that's what we've been doing. So the question again, why do they get fat, which is query, and this is the talk I gave yesterday, so the conventional wisdom. And in my sugar book, The Case Against Sugar, I refer to this as the gift that keeps on giving. And I'm going to explain why. So if you think of obesity as an energy balance disorder, and it's caused by the overconsumption of calories, you end up with this mantra that those of us in the field have heard our whole lives: a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. And so the only way that sugar can affect disease states is through people over-consuming calories. And what's fascinating, so back 5 years ago, the city of San Francisco, across the bay from where I live in Oakland, passes a law that they're going to have labeling on sugary sweetened beverages to say that these contribute to obesity and diabetes. A very benign label, but the sugar industry and the beverage industry argued against this, and they went to court, and the sugar industry lost in court, and then there was an appeal, and the expert witness for the city of San Francisco was the most prestigious nutritionist from Harvard University. They're still beeping. Okay, Mariella's telling me I can go on endlessly. I will try not to. Anyway, the expert testimony is obesity arises as a result of an energy imbalance between calories consumed and calories expended, creating an energy surplus in a state of positive energy balance, which in turn results in excess body weight over time. And that logic led them to lose the case because the judges said, look, what you're saying is the worst thing, that we get fat because we eat too many calories. So the worst that can be said about sugar is it's empty calories that people consume too much of because they like it so much. And you can't hold a product to account because people like it. And they were right. I agree with them. What's interesting is throughout the 1930s, the sugar first starts getting, in the 1950s, the sugar industry in the U.S. starts losing market share to the artificial sweetener industry. And they have to explain that sugar doesn't cause obesity. So you start getting advertisements like this. It's smart to stay slim and trim and get Domino's Energy Lift too. And this woman says, you're reducing diet calls for sugar. And certainly sugar for energy. Remember, 3 teaspoons of Domino's sugar contain fewer calories than your egg. I always wondered how they chose one egg instead of... so here's another one. This is hard to read. This is from the 1970s. Is sugar so fattening? How come so many kids are thin? That's an ad you couldn't run today, right? So the fact is, if you constantly take in more food than your body needs, you'll probably get fat. And if you eat a balanced diet in moderation, you probably won't. Sugar in moderation has a place in a balanced diet. You find the same answer today with the sugar industry. This is from their website, www.sugar.org. Sugar is not the cause of obesity. It's consuming more food than needed to maintain an energy balance causes overweight. So if you want to lose weight, you need to cut calories or increase your activity level or both. So these are behaviors. So we're not blaming anything on sugar. There are no bad foods, there are only bad behaviors. And in fact, the dietetic community has convinced themselves that you can't even tell people there are bad foods, because if you tell them something's bad, this will drive them to want to consume it. It's logic I've never quite understood. So the catch with this energy balance, calorie is a calorie thinking, is what I discussed yesterday. It's tautological, so, here's the energy imbalance, here's the wealth imbalance version of that. Wealth is, difference between dollars earned and dollars spent. Here's the climate change version of that. Climate change is a result of heat imbalance. It makes no sense whatsoever. And if this kind of explanation is absurd for wealth and climate change, why did it become the accepted explanation for obesity, which it did? And we talked about this yesterday, the history of science. It's based on the questions you could ask. And for the first 60 years of nutrition, all you could ask about were vitamin and mineral contents and energy balance. So we ended up with the theory of energy balance that's 100 years old and avoids all science post-1920, all medical science. And what it turned out, what we learned, was that consuming sugar has unique hormonal metabolic effects that favor fat accumulation and insulin dysregulation. This is what you've been hearing throughout this conference, what Mariella discussed. Okay, so you have this sort of conflict between this theory. The worst you could say about sugar is that it's empty calories, empty protein, minerals, vitamins. Again, science pre-1920, and the sugar is having unique metabolic hormonal effects, which is science post-1920. And this is a idea that I got from Robert Lustig, who gets credit for really pushing the anti-sugar movement beginning about 10 years ago. And the idea is 100 calories of sugar, so isocaloric, 100 calories, 100 calories, 100 calories. But 100 calories of sugar is metabolized differently than 100 calories of starch, which is metabolized differently from 100 calories of protein or 100 calories of fat. And the hormonal responses are entirely different. And we've been talking about that throughout this conference when we talk about insulin. So we have the hormonal regulation of fat accumulation. I showed this slide yesterday, and insulin's the principal regulator. And if you want to suppress or increase fat mobilization, you have to lower insulin. And so we had this alternative science that was being buried because of the calorie energy balance theory. But then something else happened. In the 1960s and 1970s, and we discussed this was a subtext of Ivor's talk and Mariella's, we started having a conflict between the sugar and fat and cholesterol versus metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance. So what we've grown up with is our cholesterol hypothesis, driven by people like the work of Ansel Keys and then the whole world of supposed experts. But there was always this counter hypothesis that the problem was metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance. And by always, I mean beginning in the 1950s with some of the earliest research on lipoproteins. And again, sugar was a prime suspect. And the interesting aspect about this is some of the Israeli science was critical to this. So Aaron Cohen was a MD who was spent time in the United States studying the diabetes epidemics among Native Americans. And he actually had a discussion with Jocelyn. Jocelyn believed that diabetes was primarily driven by genetic factors. And Cohen, who had been studying the Native Americans, said, no, it's something about diet and lifestyle, because you just see this explode in them. And Jocelyn said, well, why don't you go back and research this when you go back to Israel? So the population that Cohen took to study were the Yemenite Jews, because they had come over in two groups. There were emigres from Yemen who had come over prior to World War II. And then there was a new group that came over in what was called Operation Magic Carpet in 1949, 1950. So we had these two different groups of Yemenite Jewish emigres who were separated in time in their Western diet exposure by 20 years. And the second group had extremely high, the first group had high levels of diabetes, and the second group had very low levels. So he just asked the question, what was different in the diet they were being fed in Israel versus the diet they were eating back in Yemen before they emigrated? I'm so confused. And he went through this. So they were slightly increased. They ate slightly more total calories. In Israel, there was no difference in total protein. There was basically extremely little difference in fat content, and the carbohydrates consumed in the Yemen were mainly or solely starch. Almost no sugar was consumed. And in Israel, there's a striking increase in sugar consumption, though little increase in total carbs. So, and the above difference, he said, are also true when comparing the diet of the Yemen with the diet of settlers of European origin. So Cohen was one of the first people to identify sugar in the diet. Him and a physician named George Thompson did a similar analysis with the population in South Africa. And then John Yudkin comes along. And we've heard Yudkin's name today. And Yudkin was the leading British nutritionist in the 1960s. And he just made this simple point again. If we're looking for a dietary cause of some of the ills of civilization, we should look at the most significant changes in men's diet. And one of the interesting things, again, I mentioned that the question you ask determines the answer you get. So in the United States, physicians like Ansel Keys were trying to explain what they thought of as a high rate of heart disease in the U.S. And the answer they came to was saturated fat and cholesterol, and it happened to be the wrong answer. But British researchers were trying to answer a different question. They had British colonial and missionary physicians around the world who were making this observation of obesity and diabetes epidemics, and then with them heart disease and cancer epidemics worldwide. And they wanted to answer the question, what's causing these epidemics worldwide? And now you get a different answer. So now you start saying, when we look at it worldwide, the biggest change we see in diets from all these traditional diets to Western diets is first the sugar consumption and then the refinement of the grains that they're consuming. So beginning in the early 1960s, Yudkin starts writing about sugar and pointing out that this is the biggest difference. And he starts pointing out that when you consume sucrose, and this is the beginning of the metabolic. In some ways, when Jerry Reven gets credit for metabolic syndrome, Yudkin was there at the same time actually making a more profound argument, which is that when you have heart disease, coronary artery disease, you don't just have high LDL cholesterol. It's not one number. And you might not even have that, if we've heard over and over again. You have a whole range of metabolic disruption throughout your body that's captured now most prominently in metabolic syndrome. And Yudkin was saying, because sugar directly affects the hormonal responses of the body, and when you could see it in his studies in animals and in students, you could see he could basically cause each one of these effects by feeding high sugar diets. And yet Yudkin's argument too died. And Yudkin was the single most prominent European nutritionist, but he couldn't get this argument across because of this sort of authoritative streak in medicine. So Ansel Keys didn't like it. That was the first problem. And in 1971, Keys wrote an article that started off as a letter to his colleagues explaining why Yudkin was wrong about everything. Because if Yudkin was right that sugar was a fundamental problem, Keys was wrong about dietary fat. And Keyes didn't like that. Keyes was the kind of guy that he would be described as doesn't suffer fools gladly, which is a sort of synonym for somebody who doesn't, fool is defined in those cases as anyone who disagrees with me. This was how Keyes phrased it. He said, the widely publicized theory that sucrose in the diet is a major factor in the development of coronary heart disease has been examined, meaning I examined it. The theory is not supported by acceptable clinical, epidemiological, theoretical, or experimental evidence. It's been claimed that the theory is supported by international statistics, by the time trend of the incidence rate, by comparison of dietary habits of coronary patients and controls, and by experiments. Not one of these claims is justified by the actual evidence. Not one of them. Then the other problem is the sugar industry didn't like it. So the sugar industry had a serious problem. When they were competing against artificial sweeteners, they could go after artificial sweeteners, which they did. And by 1970, cyclamate, one of the most popular artificial sweeteners, was banned in large part because of research funded by the sugar industry in the US. They funded people at Harvard to push as we'll see, to attack the sugar work. But they had to go after Yudkin, and they had to go after this argument that sugar caused disease, because that was directly affecting their bottom line. This is how it was phrased by Jack Tatum, who is the president of the Sugar Association, Inc., which is a lobbying and research arm of the sugar industry. He said, in confronting our critics, we try never to lose sight of the fact that no confirmed scientific evidence links sugar to the death-dealing diseases. This crucial point is the lifeblood of the association. Now, what's interesting about this is often today the sugar industry, because of my work, is compared to the tobacco industry. But I don't believe that's a true comparison. What the tobacco industry had to do was convince the world that the research done by very good scientists was wrong. What the sugar industry had to do was convince the world that what apparently very good scientists and the entire nutrition community believed was right, and that it applied to sugar also. And what the nutrition community believed was that we get fat because we eat too many calories, and a calorie is a calorie. And the nutrition industry, research community had come to believe that dietary fat causes heart disease and that sugar is benign. So the sugar industry had to convince the world that that was true about sugar. So what they did is they hired Fred Stair, who was the head of the nutrition department at Harvard, and believed that part of his job was to take as much money as humanly possible from industry to funnel into his department, which is questionable about the ethics of that. And Stair was later sort of run out of Harvard when this was realized. And they hired Stair, and Stair hired a dozen very good scientists, many of them colleagues of Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota, to write articles about the role of fat and sugar in chronic diseases. And in every case, they concluded that fat was a problem and sugar isn't. And they put this out in a review. Sugar in the Diet of Man was published as a supplement in the World Review of Nutrition and Diabetes, and the sugar industry printed out 25,000 copies of this to distribute. And one of the groups that it distributed to was the FDA, which was in the process of trying to determine whether sugar should be considered generally accepted as safe as a food additive. And the FDA, through the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, which had this committee, determined that indeed sugar was safe. In part, this was because they were afraid to say that it wasn't. The sugar industry put out this ad in response, sugar is safe. And then in 1986, the Sugar Task Force, the FDA, returned to this question of whether sugar should be generally recognized as safe, a status that's known as GRAS status in the United States, and they concluded that it should. And it's interesting, Walter Glinsman, who ran this committee, later went to work for the corn refiners who were producing high fructose corn syrup. What's interesting so this was a conclusion, no conclusive evidence on sugars demonstrates a hazard to the general public when sugars are consumed at the levels that are now current. And what was interesting is how you define levels that are now current. And the FDA administrators, these 4 bureaucrats, took it upon themselves to do this assessment. And they concluded that what Americans were consuming in 1986 was 40 pounds per person per year. If you remember from the chart I showed you, by the year 1900, the sugar industry was making 90 pounds per person a year available for consumption, but somehow the FDA decided it was only 40, and this is the level that they considered safe. At that same year, the USDA was estimating 75 pounds per person, almost twice as much, and by 1999, it was 155 pounds available, out of which the idea is only some percentage is consumed. Today, the current estimate is around 90 pounds per people per year. So in 1986, the FDA concluded that less than half of this was safe for consumption. And that's why sugar should be considered generally recognized as safe. What's interesting about the 1986 report is it then was required by law to be used as sort of a true statement in government documents. And in 1984, as we heard, the United States government started pushing the idea that dietary fat causes heart disease. And they had a very large public health campaign that was included a series of massive reports. So the Surgeon General's report on nutrition and health, which came out in 1988, and the National Academy of Sciences report, Diet and Health, and these are each over 700 pages long, and they all had chapters about every possible nutrient that might lead. But the general conclusion was that dietary fat was the problem. This is how the Surgeon General put it. He said, well, many food factors are involved. Chief among them is a disproportionate consumption of foods high in fat. And they blamed 2/3 of the premature deaths in the United States on dietary fat. And they launched this idea of a low-fat diet movement. And it had unintended consequences. So one of the things we did, while the studies would say we should avoid eating too much sugar, and the only way you know you're eating too much is if you're getting fatter, we also push this low-fat idea. So you end up with products like these. So these are heart-healthy diet foods. And the reason you know that they're diet foods is because they're small portions. They're 100 calories each. So that means you can eat them safely. And the reason you know they're heart-healthy is because they have 0 fat in it, which is interesting. And then you look at the sugar content, and there's 7 grams in the Yoplait and this one and 12. And that doesn't sound like a lot of sugar, but that's 48% of calories is coming from sugar. And this is now considered a heart-healthy diet food. On my flight over from San Francisco in business class, thank you, Mariella, they served Chobani yogurt, which is heart-healthy. And Chobani, I took photos. I didn't have time to work it into my slides. Had 90 calories in a serving, so I knew it was safe to eat. And the first ingredient was yogurt, the second ingredient was cane sugar, and it too had 12 grams of sugar. 48% of the calories in it were from sugar. And this is a food we've been trained to think of as heart healthy. So the other thing that happened, I mentioned that the metabolic syndrome story begins in the 1950s, and Yudkin was pushing in the 1960s, but without that terminology. But you have a change in the science that happens. One of the problems with science is that it tends to evolve. So what good scientists are taught, a fundamental rule of good science is never overinterpret premature evidence. But when you're pushing public health and you're afraid that people are dying, you have to overinterpret. That's what you believe as a public health authority. So we started pushing the cholesterol story and the LDL cholesterol story, and then in the 1980s we launched these public health campaigns putting everyone on low-fat diets. And meanwhile, the metabolic syndrome story evolved. These researchers kept doing science on it. By 1988, Gerald Reaven is talking about metabolic syndrome. He's calling it Syndrome X. He's giving the Banting lecture for the American Diabetes Association. He's telling everyone that the fundamental problem with diabetes and maybe with heart disease is metabolic syndrome. It's insulin resistance, and it's a carbohydrate-related problem. And you start seeing metabolic syndrome being discussed and talked about, but it's after the community has decided that dietary fat is a problem. So by the early 2000s, when it's locked in as something that's real to the medical community, it's seen as a kind of, they call it an emerging disorder, as though it's like Ebola coming out of the jungle. Okay, yeah, this whole thing, sorry, okay. The question is, what causes metabolic syndrome? That's what we want to ask. We've been talking about this all the way. What do you have to add to a population's diet? And the conventional wisdom is sedentary behavior and eating too much. The biochemical wisdom is sugar. It's a combination of glucose and fructose. And when you look at the biochemists discussing metabolic effects of fructose. It's been discussed for decades. The best biochemists saying high fructose intake has indeed been shown to cause dyslipidemia and to impair liver insulin sensitivity, and although there's no compelling evidence that very high fructose intake can have deleterious effects. The role of fructose in the development of the current epidemic of metabolic disorders remains controversial, and you could see all the different ways that fructose can lead to insulin resistance and all the different ways that fructose can lead directly to the chronic diseases we're worried about. And this is a 2017 version of the same problem. So you start with fructose. This is a review article written by a half a dozen European authorities, and you end up with intestinal, a lot of the fructose is metabolized in the intestine. It passes to the liver. Through the portal vein, you get non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, decreased insulin sensitivity. It goes to the adipose tissue where you get these problems, and then to the vasculature where the result is these problems, and then to the heart where you get these problems, and even to the kidneys, and even to the brain. So this is now the accepted. Ample clinical and basic biological evidence indicates that the consumption of excess sugar promotes the development of cardiometabolic syndrome, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes. And the primary caveat is it's never been studied. I'm going to leave it with this slide. It's interesting. We spent over $1 billion testing the cholesterol heart disease hypothesis, and it's been inferred correctly that these tests failed to confirm it. And this test will never be done. These similar long-term tests where you compare populations eating sugar to randomized populations not eating sugar will never be done. They're very expensive. They have to run for 10 or 20 years. And it's funny, the reason they'll never be done is pretty simple. This is what you'd have to do. You have to randomize subjects from eating sugar to not eating sugar, and then you run them out long enough to see chronic disease effects. And if you told the National Institutes of Health in the US you want to do that, and they'd say how much would it cost, and you'd say, oh, maybe $100 million. And then they'd say, well, we can't do that study. And besides, everyone knows that if you don't eat sugar, you'll be healthier. Thank you. My apologies for running on. Thank you.